So my colleague Katie Peters, who will introduce in a moment, has just released a report is titled The Next Frontier Disaster Risk Reduction, Tackling Disasters Fragile and Conflict-Affected Context, that really tries to reflect on what are the political and institutional barriers to adapting the DRR policies, DRR practice, and overseas development assistance to this context. And Katie will tell us more about it, but it really reveals a hesitancy to explore the relationship between disasters and conflict, and really a tendency to prioritize peace and security over DRR in conflict and in conflict-affected countries and fragile countries. So today we really want to focus on exploring, some of the blockages, some of the challenges to analyze analyzing DRR in these countries, to bring more innovative approaches, to take steps that we can consider to move forwards. And to guide these discussions, I'm really joined by a stellar panel in London as well as in DC, although I don't see our colleague from DC on the video screen yet. I will introduce them in a second, but I want to first of all, welcome all of you and welcome our online audience. You will have a chance to contribute to our discussion through the chat that I can read. So put your questions, your comments. I'll take them when we open up to the floor. And for those in the room, please put your phones on silence, but do tweet. The hashtag I think you can see over there is the DRR conflict. But let me introduce the panel. To my left, I have Aisha Siddiqui, lecturer in human geography at Royal Holloway University. To my immediate right, Amjad Abashar, who is the chief of the UN Office for DRR in Africa. And my colleague, Katie Peters, who is a senior research fellow here at ODI. And on video, I can see her now, is Rina Meutia, who is disaster risk management specialist at the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery, or GFDRR, as I'm sure a lot of you know, at the World Bank. But on this program of work, we're really delighted at ODI to be working closely with the German government. So today, to open our discussion, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Thomas Helfen. Dr. Thomas Helfen is the head of the Division for Peace and Security, Disaster Risk Management at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, better known as BMZ. But before taking up his current post in 2016, Thomas also served as the head of the South Asian Division and the head of Parliament and Cabinet Affairs. Thomas, it's a privilege to have you here. My colleagues can set the lectern again. We'll start with your keynote lecture, keynote speech. Thank you.
I'll give her a helping hand. Thank you very much, Sarah, for your kind introduction, and thank you to ODI and all the team here to hosting this public event on disasters in fragile and conflict-affected countries. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, allow me to share why I feel that bringing considerations of disasters, conflict, and fragility together is a necessary precondition to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The world today faces an unprecedented multiplicity and complexity of crises and extreme challenges regarding violent conflicts. These conflicts and natural hazard-related disasters are key drivers of vulnerability. Violent conflicts in the world have increased after decades of relative decline. Since 2010, the number of major violent conflicts has tripled. By 2016, more countries were experiencing violent conflict than at any time in nearly 30 years. At the same time, first estimates expect for 2018 to be another record year for economic loss from natural disasters. Over the last year, we saw the devastating effects of hurricanes and severe floodings in too many countries. We also have to face the fact that displacement by disasters remain very high. The number of new internally displaced people reached in 2017 a total of 30 million people. Most of the displacements were caused by natural disasters, but a bit more than 1/3 were caused by violent conflicts. Disasters hit first and foremost the poorest and most vulnerable people, as they are on the front lines. Besides threatening lives and livelihoods, they undermine long-term development goals, including our common goal to substantially reduce poverty. So disasters are particularly risk multipliers in fragile contexts. There are two basic assumptions on the correlation between natural disasters and conflict. First, natural disasters have a very high potential to increase the risk of violent conflict. Why is it so? Because natural disasters can often contribute to grievances of the population, which then often create or further increases conflicts over the access to resources, which gets quite scarce when it comes to conflict. Second, very often conflict and fragility increase the impact of natural disasters. Conflict may, for example, lead to displacing people into areas more exposed to hazards, like in the case of the Rohingya community, which sought refuge in the highly exposed areas across the border in Bangladesh. And conflict typically undermines the capacity of governments and communities and NGOs to provide protection from natural hazards, and conflict reduces their capacities to help recover from the damages caused by disasters. The 2030 agenda highlighted the recognition that populations in fragile contexts suffer most and are too often cut off from global development efforts. So strengthening resilience and disaster risk reduction are elementary components of the 2030 agenda. SDG 1, to be precisely 1.5, states quite clearly, by 2030, build the resilience of the poor and those in vulnerable situations, and reduce their exposure and vulnerability to climate-related extreme events and other economic, social, and environmental shocks and disasters. More and more partner countries of the German Development Cooperation are affected by the interplay between conflict, fragility, and disaster risk. As the challenge is huge for these societies, joint efforts and tailored approaches are needed. During the spring meeting of the World Bank's GFDRR, major donors resolved to be more engaged in disaster risk reduction in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. At the UNISDR donor meeting in Geneva 3 weeks ago, we pushed hard to give DRR in fragile and conflict-affected contexts greater attention. Therefore, Germany, and especially my Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, is very happy to announce a new collaboration between Germany and ODI, and we will work together to advance this approach for the next year, culminating in the launch of a major flagship report on conflict and DRR at the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in Geneva next year, May. Through this input, we hope to improve the lives of vulnerable people who have to contend with natural hazard-related disasters in contexts affected by conflict and fragility. Let me close by saying that 3 years into the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, it has become clear that without a significant reorientation in the way we understand and act on the complex interplay of disasters and conflict, the international community risks failing to deliver on its ambition to leave no one behind. By generating an evidence base and accelerating a long overdue conversation, together with ODI, we seek to answer the question: what DRR action is viable and appropriate in fragile and conflict-affected contexts? Doing so now provides just enough time to reorientate current approaches to managing disaster risk and to influence the remaining 12 years of the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction. So let us partner up in favor of the most vulnerable. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas, for your remarks, and thank you to you and your government for your support of our work. We're really excited to be embarking on this partnership, and today really marks the launch of these initiatives that we hope will culminate in a really groundbreaking flagship report next year at the Global Platform meeting. And what you just said is really the heart of the discussion today and the work that we want to do to really answer the question of what DRR action is appropriate and is feasible in fragile and conflict-affected states. So to answer that, let me start with Katie. You've been working on this for some time. So can you help us, set the scene really and tell us why this is important and why now?
Yeah, of course. I think I want to start by, there was a saying that sort of went around quite a lot in the humanitarian community for a few years, which is that disasters do not discriminate. And that is conceptually and practically false. Disasters are neither natural nor conflict neutral. And it's not a coincidence that this statistic we hear, that 58% of disaster deaths occurred in the top 30 fragile states. That's not a coincidence. If we look back over the last couple of decades, we've seen major disasters happen in contexts that are affected by conflict and fragility. For example, in 2008, Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar. In 2010, the earthquake in Haiti. Throughout last year, recurrent droughts in Somalia. And today, as was mentioned, the very real risk of flooding facing tens of thousands of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. So I would argue, and I know many people in the room would say the same, that actually if we're genuinely serious about supporting the most vulnerable to disasters, then we need to be doing disaster risk reduction in contexts that are affected by violence, conflict, and fragility. And that needs to be a priority, both for national governments and the international community. We've actually just completed, as of yesterday, some new research by ODI that we're going to be releasing at the Asian Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction next month. And it reveals that in just under a decade, 55% of people that were killed by disasters in Asia happened in just 4 countries: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. And all 4 of those countries are at the top of the Fragile States Index for Asia. And those figures, and I can't stress this enough, they are a conservative estimate. We know that disasters in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, they're underreported and unreported. And there are also massive gaps in the data. So with complete data sets, the proportion of disaster deaths in fragile contexts is likely to be much higher than that. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the relationship between disasters and conflict, but what I would say, certainly from working on this over the last few years, is that there's a very complex intermediary role that governs the relationship between natural hazard-related disasters and dynamics of peace and conflict. And it makes for a confusing and often quite a contested evidence base. But we do know enough to know that vulnerability to disasters and to conflict can be mutually reinforcing. So we know, for example, that conflict and fragility can increase vulnerability to hazards. They can weaken the capacity of governments and local institutions to protect communities from disasters. Conversely, we know that disaster impacts, such as displacement, food insecurity, and the disruption of markets, has the potential to reinforce known drivers of conflict. Disasters can also exacerbate social exclusion and grievance by strengthening one faction over another, as some people have argued was the case in post-tsunami Sri Lanka. But we also know that disasters can open up political opportunities. And it's contested, but this has certainly been argued in the case for post-tsunami Aceh, and at least for a time in Myanmar after Nargis. So I guess what I would say in terms of setting the stage is that if we actually look as the starting point as people's lived experience of disasters, then it really does point to us needing to work much more on disaster risk reduction in these places. But for too long, that's been falling through the cracks.
I mean, what you're saying is basically that the evidence is clear, but then what have we tried to do to really make sure that attention to conflict and fragility is embedded in disasters frameworks?
Yeah, I mean, I know many people in this room, particularly prior to the Sendai framework, were really championing for there to be inclusion of recognition of conflict and fragility in the Sendai framework. And actually, I think that was true across the board. Many technical contributions to all of the post-2015 frameworks, including, for example, by the World Bank, by UNDP, by many civil society networks, try to encourage much more holistic approaches to risk management. But as we all know, the major international frameworks, they're the product of political processes. And those technical inputs were all but invisible by the time that the drafting process came to a close. And if I give you one example, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. So for 2 years prior to the Sendai Framework, I sat and I listened to government representatives from across Asia and Africa in particular discuss the very complex interplay of the links between climate change and disasters on dynamics of peace and conflict. And I saw inputs to the Sendai Framework call for greater recognition of the links between action on disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and conflict prevention, particularly from African states. But on the penultimate day of negotiations, I also sat at 3 o'clock in the morning and watched the last remaining reference to conflict and fragility, specifically as an underlying driver of vulnerability to disasters, be removed from the text. And today, the Sendai Framework does not feature the words conflict, fragility, or violence. And actually, that's a problem across all the post-2015 frameworks. There is a neglect of complex and layered risk. So what you'll see in most of the frameworks are lists. We often see lists. There's lists of threats and hazards side by side, but they're rarely considered in terms of their complex interrelationship. Now, I think it's important to clarify that's not to suggest that no work is going on in reducing disaster risk in fragile and conflict-affected states. Actually, quite the opposite. So, for example, in February, I was in Beirut, and I heard the National Disaster Management Agency and the Lebanese Red Cross discuss the challenges of adapting their existing disaster risk reduction interventions to a context where you have massive conflict-related displacement from Syria. We've also seen, for example, and this is certainly featured in our report, civil society organisations like Concern Worldwide who have really actively been trying to take much more holistic approaches to risk. So, for example, in Haiti, they've been partnering disaster risk reduction practitioners with those that work on peace and reconciliation. In Somalia, they've very proactively been taking conflict-sensitive approaches to drought and flood mitigation. But those examples, they're too few and far between, and very little exists, either conceptually or practically, on what types of DRR actions are viable and appropriate in fragile and conflict-affected states. And at the moment, there's almost no community of practice to actually champion this issue, either at the national, regional, or international level.
Thanks. Katie, well, let me go to Rina, because Rina, you actually have been one of these champions who've been, really tried to champion if you want, a more integrated attention to these issues in policy spaces, and that comes on the back of, your extensive experience in Asia of, seeing how these two areas really need to be considered together. Can you tell us a little bit about both your experience, but also what you're trying to do in the policy arena?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'm very, very excited that finally this frank discussion is happening. Thank you so much for the opportunity. So sorry that I cannot be there in person. I'm here sitting in Washington, D.C., and I hope it doesn't really matter because the message is still the same. So let me just bring back a little bit on my personal experience, why for me personally, this particular topic is super important. I happen to be very lucky. I come from Aceh, where the tsunami, the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004 hit. As an Achenese, I lived through the conflict. So before the tsunami happened, I thought, life will never change again in Aceh. So I think Katie already mentioned a little bit about Aceh experience versus what happened in Sri Lanka after the tsunami. I think everybody who have been working on this topic know that Aceh tsunami created political opportunity. At the end, we get peace agreement. And then in Sri Lanka, it's complete opposite that, the war somewhat continued. So what most people don't understand is what happened exactly on the ground to the normal people, to the beneficiaries. So my personal experience when the tsunami happened, Aceh was still under martial law. And then all this influx of international workers responding to disaster came into Aceh, who at that time close to the international public for almost like 30 years. All this influx of workers came in without knowing that Aceh had conflict. So they had this very clear mandate from their organization, their institutions and donors that they have to help the disaster victims. And then on the ground, I was affected by the disaster, but then the one who helped me, a family who were affected by conflict, who just moved from the rural areas to Banda Aceh City, and then the disaster happened. And they just started rebuilding their lives, and they're still struggling. And when we get this assistance from disaster, they were denied from the assistance because they are so-called conflict victims. So they are not supposed to get the assistance. So while they are hosting disaster victims. So what I'm trying to say, on the ground, there's very little distinction, actually non-existence. Conflict, disaster victim, they don't really matter. And it creates jealousy because I have access to some kind of humanitarian assistance, and they have never been helped for more than 30 years, and they're also struggling. And on top of that, they're trying to help the disaster victims, and it created a very severe jealousy. And unfortunately, all the workers, UN agencies, all NGOs, they're basically cut off guard because there's a conflict there and nobody knows there was a conflict there. So there were no policies or regulation that actually can help them try to deal with the situation on the ground. So that's first my personal experience. And then they sent me to Pakistan afterward. I thought it was exclusive to Aceh. And then it was the same thing again, Kashmir, when the earthquake in 2005 happened. That's another conflict setting. Again and again, I saw that workers, international responders, not equipped to deal with the conflict situation. They are afraid to make the steps. Is it their role to actually create peace or to support peace, or should they help the disaster victims? But they have limited mandate, and they have a very clear mandate not to help them, just for disaster victims. So again, I had the opportunity to work in Myanmar. And then again, it was the same story, again and again. And then as you all know, I worked for the World Humanitarian Summit back in 2015. And then we undertook a couple of regional consultations throughout the world. These topics, whenever we created an event, just a specific session on disaster risk reduction, conflict elements kept on popping up in the discussion, and people demanded that they wanted a clarity on what they should do on the ground to address the problem. And we tried to consolidate them, put them in the synthesis report, trying to generate some kind of action plan or commitments from all partners, but a lot of people seem to be reluctant. And then, of course, with the Sendai that Katie just explained, that sort of like bring down the issues a little bit back on the ground again. I personally am very curious. Why is this issue is so hard to fly? I think this is something that is very confusing for me. And at the end of WHS, unfortunately, we still didn't manage to bring this topic flying. And now I joined GFDRR, a typical disaster risk reduction program that actually support reducing vulnerability, building resilience. And unfortunately, I don't know, maybe finally all the work on the ground finally come up together. I finally see the light at the end of the tunnel.
So what are you doing? Tell us a bit more. What are you doing? What is GFDRR doing to bring it together concretely?
Right. GFDRs have been working in FCV, fragile conflict countries, ad hocly. As you know, we have probably over 140 of our client countries. They are fragile countries. So we have done a lot of operations, typical disaster operation in Afghanistan, in Somalia, all this setting. And then we can't avoid not to address those issues. We have, for instance, using DRM, disaster risk reduction tools and approaches in countries like Syria and Iraq, and it creates evidence that disaster risk reduction can be actually a very good entry point for such countries. But now, more work that we are trying to do right now, we are finally trying to create one initiative, how we can do better, not ad hocly, but by design, a DRM approach in a fragile and conflict setting. So it's still very new, but I want to be hopeful, and we just pitch in this new initiative in our in Mexico during Understanding Risk conference at our CG meeting, and we are hopeful that hopefully we will have positive response from many donors. So we are looking forward that hopefully in the next few months we will have something tangible, something concrete to report. I think this is a bit too early to say exactly what we are going to do, but the positive work is emerging here and there, and I don't want to talk something too much before everything actually fall in place, but this is the best timing, and I cannot be more excited than I am right now. I mean, after 12 years, after the tsunami, something's finally happening. I'll stop there, and then we can have more conversation afterward.
Well, but Amjad, you've got a lot of experience of working particularly with African governments on these things. What are the obstacles to think in a more holistic way about risk? Why is it so hard, as Dina is saying?
No, thank you, Sarah. And I just wanted to just stress again that the challenge of disaster risk reduction, as with due respect to fragile and conflict-affected countries, the challenge of raising awareness about the importance of disaster risk reduction is still there, and we're still trying to overcome that, the big picture issue. So that's very important for us. We're working on that practically as much as possible, but I just don't want people to lose focus of the fact that disaster risk reduction is still undermined or in competition with the CNN effect, with the humanitarian needs and that particular area of work where there is much more attention paid by the donors and international community. So that's very important to note. Now, having said that, I think I've worked both in Africa and the Arab states, and the report of ODI has an interesting statement. I think you call it the Sendai framework is conflict blind, and I think that you explained why, because there's no mention of the language on conflict, violence, and so on. But that does not preclude us at the regions from actually making progress on disaster risk reduction. Now, when it comes to the Sendai framework, I believe we have and are making progress in disaster risk reduction when it comes to two of the four priorities of the Sendai framework, namely the first one on understanding risk and the second one on governance. The third one has to do with investment in risk. There we have problems in fragile and conflict-affected countries. Indeed, we have problems in least developed countries because of obvious financial weaknesses when it comes to financial capacities and making resources available to or mainstreaming disaster risk reduction resources into the various government ministries. Now, I have found it easier to work at the regional level and the sub-regional level, and I have to say that in the example of Africa, the issue of conflict and implementing disaster risk reduction in conflict-affected areas and fragile areas came as a surprise, the fact that it wasn't there in the Sendai framework. And I think that has to do with the fact that the way the Sendai framework was negotiated, a lot of the negotiators in Sendai, in Japan, or in the prep meetings before that led up to Japan, the Sendai meeting, are actually more the political negotiators. They're not the DRR practitioners in many ways. They're not the actual disaster risk reduction practitioners. So when we went to the regional level, we found that disaster risk reduction practitioners welcomed including the conflict and fragile affected states. One example of that is the African Union last year endorsed at the highest level at the African Union Summit the program of action for the implementation of the Sendai Framework in Africa. One of the sentences in that document calls for a coherent approach to disaster risk reduction that takes into account, as Dr. Thomas said, the SDGs, the climate change, and conflict and fragility. So for them, it came there nonchalantly. It wasn't an issue of contention or anything of that sort. Now, that has actually translated at the sub-regional level, where sub-regional organizations, where we call regional economic communities, such as IGAD, ECOWAS, SADC, have actually translated that into their own sub-regional strategies for disaster risk reduction. They've developed those. So there are structures in place to take forward disaster risk reduction in Africa, including in fragile and conflict-affected states. There's some work there. We can get into that later. And more importantly, these same regional organizations, such as the African Union and the regional economic communities, have actually established disaster risk reduction units with staff, human beings sitting there to try and move this across. So the political buying at the regional, sub-regional level is there. So I think we've had a lot of good experience, Sarah, with this, and there's a lot of positive progress being made. But having said that, the issue, I go back to my first point, is the issue of the disaster risk reduction awareness about DRR and not confusing it with disaster response is still an issue for us. There's about 32 out of the 44 sub-Saharan African countries that have national strategy on disaster risk reduction, claim to have national strategy on disaster risk reduction. But when you look at them, you find that they are response strategies. So there's a lot of work to do there. And one of the important things that I need to quickly finish with is that the first deadline coming up for Sendai is the target E of the Sendai framework, which is the target related to the fact that all countries should report develop national strategies for disaster risk reduction. This happens in 2020, so this is right in front of us. And I think that would be an important opportunity to bring in the agenda of the fragile and conflict-affected and the importance of including that and taking it into account when implementing disaster risk reduction framework. So there is a lot of progress in that.
So that's clearly a critical opportunity to seize, going forward, trying to use, the achievement of Target E to push that agenda. What are other opportunities? I'm thinking of the African Arab Ministerial Conference, on disaster risk reduction, but there may be others that you have in mind.
Yeah, I think it's important just to announce also that the African Arab Conference, African and Arab Conference, is the first time they were actually combining the two regions on disaster risk reduction, or what we call the regional platform, will be held in October in Tunisia. This is it's a tricky one, and we hope we'll be able to sort of bring the two regions together to at least share practices. But they both regions have obviously the issue of fragility and conflict is very important in the countries there. So I think the best thing we can do is, at least because we have a ministerial segment in that particular conference, is to reach some sort of political, provide some sort of, ensure that we include some sort of political language in the political declaration, the ministerial level declaration, which can thereafter be taken at the highest level, the African Union Summit, and maybe I'm dreaming here, and the League of Arab States Summit, to ensure that it is endorsed as something that is accepted, meaning that fragile, conflict-affected and fragile countries have to have deserved and due attention in terms of implementing disaster risk reduction program, and that the political support by the heads of states and by national governments has to be there. And one way to do that is to make sure that we use the regional platform, the African and Arab states, as a vehicle for that.
Great. Well, let me come to Aisha. Rina has already given us the flavor, what it has meant for her to be sort of been in an environment which obviously was affected by conflict and by a natural hazard disaster at the same time. You've done a lot of work in Pakistan, in the Philippines. Give us a flavor of what it means, what's the lived experience of people that are, affected by insurgency, by an armed conflict, and at the same time by a natural hazard.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about the kind of work that I do, and as you know, I come at this very much from kind of an academic background. So the work that I do is that I use kind of anthropological methods where I spend time with people who are affected by disasters, who are also living amidst conflict and insurgency, to try and understand that kind of how the two experiences are lived. And to kind of present to you some very new research that I've been doing in the Philippines, because I think that kind of shows how the not understanding of the issue, or the lack of understanding of these issues, creates a very specific set of problems and challenges. So I was working in this part of the Philippines that's affected by a communist insurgency, and it was in 2012 affected by this really large kind of Category 5 typhoon as well. And there were very large kind of a very high death toll, because a lot of people were buried under debris and they were never found. But additionally, there are all of the challenges of the insurgency and military encampments and all the rest of it. So what the state thought they would do in one of the most affected parts of this community was that they would relocate everyone away from the hazardous area, and they were provided kind of land titles in the relatively safer area. They were provided building materials to construct houses. They were given cash transfers. They were provided with all of this so that they could be safer. And it was, to credit to the state, it was meant to be a kind of universal intervention, that everyone who lives in the hazardous area should receive this. What kind of ended up happening on the ground was that only those people who were relatively privileged enough to have a land title to show that they lost a house were given a new house. So everyone who didn't have a land title then got left behind. Everyone who was kind of physically disabled and couldn't climb up to the higher area got left behind. Everyone who happened to be from the indigenous, the more vulnerable communities, etc., couldn't show all the paperwork, got left behind. So effectively, you had this whole kind of area of people who were just vulnerable and marginalized, still living in the hazardous area. And they're still living in the hazardous area, which also ultimately makes them much more vulnerable to the conflict, because now on paper at least, no one should be living in that hazardous area. It should be abandoned technically. So the military is now allowed to construct an encampment right in the middle of the main road, which otherwise in rules of engagement they're not allowed to do. They're meant to be whatever 40 some kilometers away from the main road. But now they're right in the middle of the main road. So in kind of my conversations with people, when I was asking them what are they kind of most afraid of, they're in fact most afraid of this state's idea of security. They don't want this military encampment here. What they're most afraid of is that they're going to get stuck in the encounter between the military and the insurgents. So now they're more vulnerable to the hazard, and they're also more vulnerable to the encounters between the military and the insurgents. So what was meant to be kind of relocation of people, we're intervening in the aftermath, and this was a relatively kind of thought through intervention. There were some Mines and Geosciences Bureau, some MGB guys went out there and did a survey and did their studies and all of that. So what was meant to be kind of relocation policy has ended up creating all sorts of vulnerabilities for people who are already vulnerable. And repeatedly in my work, and also in Pakistan, there was definitely this sense that what people are afraid of are very often those very ideas of security that the state is championing. So I think there's a real disconnect between how the state is understanding security and between the lived experience of people who are experiencing the disaster, the insurgency, the conflict, and in the case of Pakistan, a certain kind of Islamist radicalization as well.
So what do you think should have happened? How could have this been operationalized in a different way, the response, bringing together an understanding of both risks and managing it together?
That's a good question, and I think as an academic, I always kind of shy away and say it's complicated, but I will kind of throw out another experience of undertaking this research, which was that when I was in the kind of municipal DRM offices, and they were doing, so of course the Philippines is also quite a poster child for getting a lot of DRR right, you know, and they were doing something that was quite kind of engaging, quite bottom up. They had called people down from specifically kind of far off barrios, and they had come and they were creating these very local hazard maps and all of that with the municipal DRM officers, and there was a whole workshop, a day-long workshop taking place. And what was really kind of, and I think this is going to, in a roundabout way, address your question. When I was witnessing this this engagement between the people and the MDRM officers, there was definitely this sense that people were like, no, and this area we want to star here. We want to say this is conflict, or we want to avoid this area. And the municipal DRM guys had no idea what to do with that. They were like, no, let's not talk about this. Like, let's talk about where is the highest or the greatest hazard with regards to the flooding, with regards to the landslide. They weren't really able to put the conflict in the context of the hazard maps that they were creating. And I think it's very kind of true the other way around as well. When you speak to the security agencies, they're also equally kind of like, no, we are talking about a hard security, about keeping the insurgents out. We're not talking about keeping people safe from things like flooding and landslides and typhoons. So I think both sides, there's almost no understanding that the two have to be integrated, because they are in people's everyday lives and their everyday experiences.
Maja, you're nodding a lot. Do you have any good example of how you've seen this, be done, if not well, but better than in many other places?
Well, I was mentioning earlier to Katie, we had a little meeting here, is that looking at the list of fragile countries and conflict-affected countries that the OECD has done, I realized that we are working in Africa in particular in 53% of those countries, but we're not labeling them as fragile and conflict-affected. And the success we have made has to do, the key thing that we're looking for in those countries is to collect evidence on the disaster loss, evidence on in terms of losses, economic losses, human losses, property, etc. And one of the things that we're trying to do, we're doing this in about over 30 countries now in Africa have that. About 7 or 8 in the Arab states have that, which is what we call the disaster loss database. And it's basically a historical database that goes back 30 years to identify and collect statistics on where these losses are happening in these countries. And with that, once we have that, we're able to actually use it to inform development, identify where the vulnerabilities are, and so forth and so on. There's one story that if I could quickly just say. Many years ago, I was working in the humanitarian fields, and I was working in Sierra Leone. And I remember distinctly that that country had a lot of rain, and later on I realized that it has the highest level of rainfall in Africa. Later, I also noticed during my stay there that the rain didn't cause too much trouble. There were natural drainage that were just carved into mountains. And it struck me that it was very interesting that, you get all this amount of rain, highest in Africa, and it just, drains without too much harm. Last year, in August of 2017, there was this major tragedy in Sierra Leone in which about 1,000 people died because of a landslide that occurred, in a post-conflict fragile country. And it brought to mind to me, is like, what happened? What happened? What happened was people created new risk in this particular fragile country. They created new risk, a risk of an urban nature in which unplanned structures were built and actually affected the way the natural movement of water and floods. So these are things that are, for me, it struck me so hard that particular point was important. And we're trying to understand that. We're trying to identify these risk areas. This is one of the examples. We need to find out in our disaster loss database, okay, this occurred here, and these are the losses that were made in terms of lives, and these are the losses that were made instead of economic losses. And therefore, when we plan again in Sierra Leone, we need to make sure that we don't make the same mistake again and create new risk.
Like how you started with the positive side, which is the database, but we ended up telling us another horror story, basically.
couldn't help.
Any positive one, Katie, from all the research you have done that we can really take away and think, oh, wow, that's something to be inspired by?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why this topic I think is so tricky is because you do tend to come back to this challenge of it's context specific. And I think what's interesting is that there's a real sort of disparity at the moment. So there's a lot of work that's happening on the ground, for example, through civil society organizations doing community-based disaster risk reduction in really difficult to work operating environments. So there are really good examples, and a lot of them are documented. A lot of them have robust monitoring evaluation systems, and there's lots of reports showing the experiences and the lessons from those individual interventions. But there's nothing that brings that all together. Like, we're often asked as ODI, oh, can you point me in the direction of some literature or some advice on, okay, how do you design a new disaster risk reduction program in this particular type of context of conflict? And I can't point people to anything. There's a lot out there, but it's fragmented. It's not collated in a way that's useful. Most of it doesn't sort of have descriptions at the end about actually genuinely what's learned that might be applicable in other contexts, what was very context specific. There's a real sort of disparity at the moment, sort of on the one hand where there's a lot of grounded experience, but there's no bringing together of that experience in a way that's actually useful.
Fair enough. Well, let me open to the audience. We've talked quite a lot. I realize that we've got about 40 minutes left. So raise your hand if you want to take the floor. There'll be microphones going around. Say who you are, if you are affiliated to any particular organizations. I do encourage our colleagues who are following online to also put questions through the chat that is at the bottom of your screen. Let me see who wants to start.